Everyone, and welcome back to the Literature Channel. I'm Tim Wilson, and today's lecture is an introduction to Plato, especially with respect to how to approach the form of his works, the dialogue form, which is unique and requires that we pay special attention to certain defining features of the dialogue form. So let's get started. First off, who's Plato? Of course, the ancient Greek philosopher, student of Socrates, teacher of Aristotle. You can see his proximate dates there, end of the 5th century, early 4th century for the Common Era. In terms of his enduring legacy, it's difficult to think of any philosopher that's had more of an impact on the tradition. In fact, Alfred North Whitehead famously remarked, "The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato." And I think that's so true in terms of his impact, how he's permeated thought and culture in ways that are often not even perceived. So we're not going to go into all of Plato's concepts. This introduction is on his form, the dialogue form, how to approach that form. And the point of departure for me is we need to take the dramatic form of the dialogue seriously. We have to be careful not to ascribe any view spoken by one of the characters as necessarily Plato's own view. It's part of a nuanced drama taking place, and not everyone does that, right? So often people will just take quotes from the dialogue and say, okay, this is Plato's theory of X as stated in Phaedrus, and here we go, just quoting from it out of context, akin to a philosophical treatise. So they're not treatises. We can't just take them out of context. We have to take into account the dramatic context. Now, this is particularly the case with respect to the forms. So the forms, his theory of forms, the fact that, kind of in a nutshell, that all things, all particular entities that we encounter have some sort of idea, also called a form, or essence that is apart from it, is separate from it, that provides some sort of unifying principle of all particular manifestations of that idea. That theory of forms has really imprinted the Western tradition. It's one of those Platonic concepts that has really forged the tradition and has been the root of that Alfred North Whitehead quote about the philosophic tradition being a series of footnotes to Plato. It's one of the most important ones. And especially with respect to the dualistic tendency within the Western metaphysical tradition of seeing that there's a realm of becoming, of a bunch of particulars that are changing, and then a realm of eternal essences. That dualistic tradition, based on Plato's theory of the forms, is based on a reading, I think, of Plato that maybe glides over the dramatic aspect, because the theory itself and problems with the theory are highlighted in the dialogues themselves, most notably in the Parmenides. So that theory of the forms, I think we need to take with as a question, or rather than eternal essences, maybe they're eternal questions that we need to return to, as opposed to, let's say, substantial entities with defined qualities. So that would be one example of many where the Platonic tradition itself, in not necessarily taking into account always the dialogic form, has, let's say, crystallized or metastasized around a particular notions that can themselves be called into question. So my point of departure, I borrow from Heidegger in seeing the importance of the unfolding of being, or let's say ontological questions within the Platonic texts. I take those seriously, but also following Leo Strauss, I'm attentive to, let's say, the political dimension of Plato's thought, namely And one key element here being the solution to the quarrel of philosophy and poetry that Plato seems to have found, and in the form of an esoteric doctrine that can maybe best be conveyed, as we'll see, through the dialogue form. And I think, in passing, one scholar that has quite beautifully brought those two strands together is John Sallis, brings together both those strands in remaining attentive to the dramatic element akin to Strauss, but also taking the ontological claim seriously akin to Heidegger. So I highly recommend the book that I've pictured on the right, Being and Logos. So before we get started, some historical context. I have another video on the Golden Age of Athens that goes into more detail in these things, but Plato is writing at the tail end of the classical age of Greece, and what you could call the Golden Age of Athens, 5th century Athens, which begins at the tail end of the 6th century BCE with democratic reforms, and Cleisthenes is an important figure there, which instituted Athenian democracy. The beginning of the 5th century, we have these wars of Greek city-states against the Persians in a series of two massive invasions from the Persian Empire from the east. The Greeks were able to beat them off, notably especially in the second invasion. Athens ends up taking on a real leadership role and begins to amass, in effect, a naval empire in the Aegean Sea. And that ushers in what I have highlighted there in the third bullet, what we could call an Athenian ascendancy. During the age of Pericles, we have a political supremacy as well as a cultural flourishing in this period. We have the Peloponnesian Wars, the next notable event I want to highlight, towards the end of the 5th century BCE, ending with the ultimate defeat of Athens by Sparta. We don't need to go into this in detail, but a map of the territories we're talking about and a map of some of the main players within the Peloponnesian War. In blue here we have Athens and the Delian League, Athens and its empire, so to speak. In this blue Aegean region, we have Sparta and her allies in red here, and they fought for close to 30 years, ultimately ending with Athens' defeat. So Athenian democracy collapses. There's a tyranny of the 30 established, and democracy is ultimately restored in 403 BCE. And when it's restored, people are saying, what happened? We lost the war. We had a tyranny of kind of a collective of 30 that had been established there, and we nearly lost our democratic freedoms. Who's to blame? And certain elite families were to blame, and certain figures such as Socrates were kind of lumped into that. Socrates, who's Plato's philosophical inspiration, was executed ultimately on the grounds of impiety and corrupting the youth, and perhaps due to his association with some of the members of this tyranny of the 30. This is a detail from a famous painting on the right here by Jacques-Louis David, entitled "The Death of Socrates." Just a remarkable painting of a scene depicted in one of Plato's dialogues called the Phaedo, which depicts his final hours before he drinks his hemlock, the means of execution in Athens. And the dialogue involves a discussion of the soul and how Socrates is not ultimately afraid of death because he believes the soul is eternal, but also a very important discussion of Socrates' own intellectual biography in the middle of that dialogue, how, according to that dialogue, he moved from a study of the natural things, the natural world, and ultimately found that you could never get conclusive findings there, that something's going to be bigger than this over here, but small on another scale, and that there's not truth to be found in that realm. Pardon me. And he turned to the human things, and he turned to logoi, discourses, how humans in their interactions gather together. That the root of that word logos is to gather, the disparate phenomena of existence into a whole, such that they can be a meaningful articulation of the world for humans. So he turns from the things to themselves, which he says are kind of blinding. He says this in the Phaedo, turns to human discourses or logoi. So Plato, another detail from that same painting, we see a figure, perhaps Plato, casting his head down in despair that Socrates has chosen to take this hemlock rather than flee, and that decision is depicted in the Crito, another Platonic dialogue. So Plato can be seen, and his dialogues could be seen as an extended defense of Socrates against these charges, showing readers that what Socrates taught was actually beneficial for the city. He shows us Socrates made, quote, young and beautiful. This is from Plato's second epistle. So Plato, according to legends, had written tragedies before encountering Socrates. So his philosophic turn after meeting Socrates is accompanied by a literary transformation as well, from writing tragedies per se to these new kind of philosophic dramas. So this dialogue form. So as I said, the first thing we need to consider when approaching the Platonic dialogue is its form. So they're not philosophic treatises in the manner of Aristotle. They're like dramas. Like all drama, what we hear is not the voice of the author, but the voice of certain characters. Plato himself is only present in one dialogue, the Apology of Socrates, and there he does not speak. So the problem is akin to trying to discern the views of Shakespeare if we just take utterances or particular characters. So for instance, we cannot say that Shakespeare felt that life was a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury signifying nothing, which is a famous quote from Macbeth. We'd have to say, oh no, these are the views of a particular character of questionable moral substance at a particularly fraught moment of his own life. And this general point of comparing Plato to Shakespeare, I'm referring here to Leo Strauss's The City and Man. He has an extended chapter there on Plato, Plato's Republic, and he makes this point quite clearly. One could assert, perhaps, that Socrates is Plato's spokesperson. So it's not just any character. I'll take Socrates as let's say, the surrogate for Plato's views. However, what Socrates is famous for is irony. Socrates does not always mean what he says, and he speaks in different ways to different people. So we have to at least be attentive to that. Also, Socrates in some of the dialogues is either not present or is largely silent, and others take on the main part of the discussion. So in Parmenides and Timaeus, the title characters present the dominant arguments. In the Theaetetus and the Sophist and the Statesman, it's the Eleatic stranger, a disciple of Parmenides, carries on the discussion. And in the Laws, Socrates is absent, and it's the Athenian stranger. So to return to this question of irony and use that as a key to entering the dialogues, from the classical perspective, irony is part of the virtue of the magnanimous man. So in his discussion of the virtue of truthfulness, Aristotle says that on one side, of course, for Aristotle, these virtues are always a mean between two extremes. On the one extreme would be boastfulness, so saying more than what one knows. more than what is actually within one's power, and then to understate things or to say to speak less than one knows would be the ironist. Now, he says that truthfulness is not always what you need in particular situations. That mean is going to shift in different situations depending on the context and depending on to whom you're speaking. So being truthful and frank, but ironical in dealings with the many is a virtue of this magnanimous man. And so I have some references there to the Nicomachean ethics where he makes these points. We could compare this to the notion of grace as presented by Castiglione in his book of the court here, which is itself a rewriting of another Platonic dialogue, a beautiful dialogue called Plato's Symposium, which I highly recommend. So irony is related to the natural order of rank among men. It means speaking differently to different kinds of people. And at this point, I'll just refer you to I have a series of lectures on esotericism and one in particular on the authorial philosophy and poetry that ultimately leads up to some of these discussions. Also, the last of that lecture, the fourth lecture, describes how in a democratic age that we believe in equality, we are somewhat blind to the premises of esoteric literature because it takes as its point of departure this order of rank. So does the point of departure of irony and of the irony of Socrates, and to some extent the dialogue form. So to understand Plato's philosophy, we need to understand the literary form, as we've been saying. And when it comes to literary considerations, the Phaedrus raises a couple of interesting points we need to take into account. I'll leave a link in the description. There's a text I have on Plato on Eros that goes through the Plato's Phaedrus in more detail. But in this dialogue, it starts with Socrates dialoguing with Phaedrus and following Phaedrus outside the city, notably the first time or the only time we have in a Platonic dialogue where Socrates is depicted outside the city. He's always within the city. He follows Phaedrus outside the city because he's enticed, he's seduced, so to speak, by the fact that Phaedrus has this speech written down from a sophist named Lysias on love. And he wants to hear this speech, and he hears the speech. He then proceeds to give a couple of his own speeches on love, which are found to be better than Lysias's speeches. And then this leads to a discourse on speech, a discourse on discourse and the nature of discourse, as well as the nature of the soul, as well as finally a critique of writing as a form of speech making. So he proceeds in this discussion of discourse, or the discussion of the correct form of speech making, to distinguish his own philosophic rhetoric from sophistic rhetoric. So sophistic rhetoric, such as that of Lysias, the other famous ones we meet are Protagoras in that dialogue, Gorgias in a dialogue named after Gorgias. Sophistic rhetoric does not look to the truth of the matter, but only, or what is best for the soul, but rather involves memorization of linguistic tricks with the aim of winning the argument, whereas philosophic rhetoric involves the study of different types of soul and the types of speech best suited to it. So sophistry is akin to one who does not know medical science, but only doesn't know the nature of the body, but can follow a prescription or a recipe. And philosophic rhetoric is akin to the one who knows the nature of the body, knows medical science, and can properly properly diagnose the cure. So this distinction would presumably be demonstrated in the earlier speeches on love. So Lysias did not know Phaedrus's true nature and did not gear his speech accordingly, whereas Socrates did gear his speech. Socrates, in other words, speaks in different ways to different people. And this is the important point for understanding the dialogues. We can't just take what Socrates says at face value. We have to take the dramatic context. To whom is he speaking? Why is this conversation being undertaken? What are the goals of this discussion from the perspective of the other people present, from the perspective of Socrates? And then finally, in the Phaedrus, as I mentioned, there's this critique of writing. It's a famous, he turns to this Egyptian myth of Thoth and this other Egyptian deity who's described as this inventor of writing, who invents all of these arts, including writing. And there's the head Egyptian god says to Thoth, well, this is no good. What you've invented is just this kind of reminder. It's not going to give true knowledge, true wisdom. It's going to replace that. People are not going to have these things to hand, so to speak. It's going to be an externalization of their knowledge. So this critique of writing early on in the tradition, and Socrates' reflection on it, he says, this is why oral discourse is preferable to written discourse, in that the written discourse is always, in a way, dead. It says the written text always says the same thing, he says, and there's the citation of the Phaedrian text. And writing is incapable of choosing its reader, he says a little bit further down. And it's unable to defend itself from attacks. It needs its support from its father, its author. So there's those three main critiques of writing. Now, it's highly ironic, first of all, from a Platonic perspective, not just Socratic irony, but the fact that Plato has these written dialogues, right? So we have this critique of writing from an author who's obviously chosen to write. So that's a question number one. And we have critique of writing in a dialogue where the written composition itself is in some ways valorized. And I would say that I would recommend, as a way of approaching this question, Plato's Pharmacy by Jacques Derrida. So Jacques Derrida is the influential postmodern philosopher. You can see his dates there of the 20th century, and influential in the latter half of the 20th century, still influential in the 21st century. Even a lot of today's theorists and philosophers, whether it's in cultural studies, gender studies, critical race theory, a lot of these authors, even if they don't know that they're citing Derrida, are actually citing Derrida. And he shows in this work, Plato's Pharmacy, how many of the images and the language of the text of the dialogue itself seem to place this dead written substitute in the forefront. So for Derrida, part of deconstruction is to show how kind of the manifest text of what's being deconstructed, how the unsaid of the text, what's underneath, is actually going against what seems to be in the forefront. So if the surface of Plato's text seems to be critiquing writing, what's actually happening underneath, according to Derrida, is very much a valorization of writing as crucial. So for Derrida, this is all done, let's say, unconsciously through the play of language and the play of what he calls différence, the play of the deferral and the displacement of meaning through a signifying system. However, let's say if we were to take a Straussian perspective, where this concealed meaning is actually part of Plato's intention. Plato's intention was to actually valorize a certain type of writing in this surface critique of writing in the Phaedrus. Plato's intention maybe was to valorize a certain philosophic, esoteric writing that is able to overcome the defects of writing listed by Socrates. So on the Derridean deconstruction, I'll put some links to some notes I have on Derrida's deconstruction of Plato, as well as an introduction to deconstruction in general. So back to the original point. So it's in some way, Plato found an approach to writing that avoids the defects pointed out by Socrates. So perhaps the dialogue form is one way of thinking about it. The dialogue form itself is the best way to imitate the openness of oral communication. And we could say that in this way, Plato's writing somehow says different things to different audiences, just as Socrates does in his oral interactions. And we could say that this saying of different things is part of the esoteric character of Plato's works. And again, this is the Straussian angle. So his works have an external or an exoteric teaching, as well as a hidden or an inner esoteric teaching. Now, this notion of esoteric teaching, as I note on the right here, is distinct from the Tubingen School, where they emphasize the fact that Aristotle pointed out that there were unwritten doctrines that Plato taught only in an oral way in his academy, and that the dialogues, the written doctrines, are kind of all superficial, and what's the true Platonic doctrine is all unwritten. It was all only orally communicated. So there's a lot of questions there. So how would we even get at or try to approach what that unwritten doctrine would be? And of course, that has been an ongoing debate since these theories were first postulated in the middle to second half of the 20th century. So that is distinct from this notion of esoteric. So here, the esoteric approach to Plato is to say that both the external shell and the inner meaning are all within the dialogues themselves. They're all written. It's just that the writing itself has two layers of meaning. So in order to avoid the Socratic charge, Plato's writing must be alive, not dead, right? Remember, Socrates said, writing's dead. It just says the same thing. It doesn't respond. So the Platonic work has to be alive. It has to not say the same thing. It has to say different things in different contexts. It has to be able to select appropriate readers, or at least be able to say different things to different readers. And it has to be capable of responding to questioning. So that's a bit tougher to understand, I would think. The best I can, let's say, approach there would be to say that it's responsive in that it says different things to different people. So in that way, it's responsive, but also in that a dialogue, if responded to authentically by the audience, affects a transformation upon the soul of the reader. So there is the dialogue, if responded to properly, is not just a static formula. It's not like the recipe, right, that we talked about, or the prescription. It has to know the soul. The soul has to interact with that dialogue text, and there has to be a back and forth dialogue within that reading act itself, so to speak. So the dialogue to act as dialogue can't just be this written dead letter. You have to really interact with it and ask yourself the same questions as Socrates poses to his interlocutors. So back to this question of philosophy and rhetoric, in order to say different things to different audiences, Plato, we could say, marries the way of philosophic inquiry with the way of the rhetorician or the poet. So he's uniting, in one sense, Socrates and Thrasymachus. So Thrasymachus we see at the beginning of the Republic. And this, again, Leo Strauss points this out in his work, Persecution and the Art of Writing. He says, quote, "The Platonic way is a combination of the way of Socrates with the way of Thrasymachus. For the intransigent way of Socrates is appropriate only for the philosophers dealing with the elite, whereas the way of Thrasymachus is appropriate for his dealings with the vulgar." So it's a uniting of the inquirer into the nature of things with the ability to sway the many. And again, I'll refer you to another way of thinking about that. I'll refer you to the second of the lectures on esoteric literature, where we talk about the quarrel of philosophy and poetry and how philosophy had to really respond to the poetic critique of Aristophanes. And Aristophanes was demonstrating that Socrates is, in the clouds, how Socrates is could be at the hands of the many, a Strepsiades who burns down the thinkery unless he accommodates himself and accommodates his way of life to the many. So if the wisdom of the philosopher consists of his questioning of the nature of things, the wisdom of the poet consists of his knowledge of the passions of the human soul, and Plato combines this wisdom of philosopher, wisdom of poet. So the Phaedrus, to go back to some of these literary considerations. So we talked about literary consideration of, okay, well, it's a dialogue, so it has to, we have to be kind of attentive to dramatic form of it, and we'll return to that again. It's written, so, but it's got to be a particular type of writing that is not just kind of a dead letter with a set of facts. We have to think about it as speaking differently to different people in different contexts of being a dialogue itself with the reader. The other literary consideration in the Phaedrus is this notion of logographic necessity, Plato or Socrates calls it, of a perfected speech, wherein every part of the discourse has its proper place and performs its appropriate function. So thinking of the work as an organic, kind of a unity of an organic whole. Now, this notion from the Phaedrus has had an immense impact on literary theory in terms of trying to think about works as having an organic unity and a proper structure. And it raises the question, okay, did Plato think of his own texts in this way, where all components of a Platonic dialogue are there by design and have a particular structure, and nothing is there by chance? Now, this is very much the Straussian point of departure, that nothing is there by chance. They're all there by design, and it's a question of trying to figure out what is the design. But it leads to that broader question. Is that the goal of our interpretation, to try to discover the Platonic intention? I mentioned Derrida before. So the point of departure of deconstruction, and this is following to some extent Nietzsche and Heidegger. The point of view there is not to find the intention of Plato, because Plato's conscious intentions belie deeper unconscious or unsaid forces that are at work. So for Nietzsche, it would be the will to power. For Heidegger, it's the unsaid unfolding of being throughout the tradition. And for Derrida, it's this play of the signifying system that I mentioned. So for Strauss and Strauss's followers, we need to look to that Platonic intention. There's a design there, and if we follow it, we can find the intention. For others, it's not necessarily the case. Maybe it's not available to us. So that becomes part of the question. Now, on this question of authorial intent and how we approach, let's say, the unity of the work, and does it point to an authorial intention, we should note that in the Republic, each citizen is a part of a whole, the organic community. And each citizen, in terms of the definition of justice posited there, needs to play its part in that larger order of the whole. However, we find that the notion that the individuals are somehow born with a natural affinity for some job, some natural affinity to fill that part of the political whole, that itself is one element of the noble lie that is described as a lie that will be needed to be told to the community so that they accept the reforms that are being discussed in that discussion in the Republic. Also, at the level of the individual as a whole, so if we think of individuals as their own wholes, at the beginning of that discussion of the Cydian speech, they first say, okay, well, what kind of organization would we have? We see that there's no individual that is self-sufficient. They're going to need other trades, et cetera, to supplement them. So, so we see again that each individual is supplemented or coupled with others who supply what the individual lacks. And if we transpose this back to the question of the text as a unity, this means that a texts, rather than being organic closed off wholes, need to be supplemented or can't be understood in themselves, but always will be supplemented with other texts. And this goes to the problem of new criticism. So new criticism, at some point I'll do a lecture on new criticism as an important literary point of departure in the early 20th century. But in a nutshell, it tries to approach the work as this sealed off object. In extreme cases, they would attempt even to try to erase or try to forget who is the author, what's the title, what year was it produced, and just say, okay, I'm going to read this poem in total isolation from historical context, any reference to other texts written by that author or at that time. That's the extreme case of an approach to organic unity, that this entity can exist, has its own proper boundaries, can be approached on its own terms. However, as we said, just looking at how individuals as wholes are approached within the Republic, we see, okay, well, no, they have to be connected with and supplemented with other individuals to form a larger whole. And the whole that is most proper from the human perspective is the political whole, so to speak. It's the only whole that we can belong to and begin to understand properly. We can't understand the cosmos as a whole, but we can try to understand political things. So to understand or complete the Republic itself, then, we would need to, if we again putting that thinking back to texts, we need to supplement it with trying to say, okay, well, how do other texts help us understand it? Maybe we need to understand the Platonic oeuvre as a whole, like Plato's collected works. Maybe we need to understand ancient Greek philosophy as a whole. Maybe we need to understand the impact on the tradition. So this means the job of interpretation could well be infinite. Also, we should note that this idea of an organic unity of a text is tied to the notion and the fact that there is a design to that unity, right? There's an authorial intention, is tied to notions of divine intention or nous in the ancient Greek context that has ordained all elements of existence to be suited to their function. So that humans, for example, have the power to reason and that this is not a product of chance or as we might say today, of a self-emerging order through evolution, rather that it's product of design. This would be one, let's say, corollary to the notion that works have authorial intention that is accessible to us. So within the classical context that we see, at least of Socrates, and to some extent, I think we can take that to Plato as well. If there is a divine mind, if there is, that has ordered existence, including human existence, with a certain purpose, if there is this divine mind or intention behind things that guides existence, that divine intention is not accessible to us. So this is a quote from Xenophon's Memoirs of Socrates, or Memoribilia. In general, he, Socrates, dissuaded them from concerning themselves with the way in which God regulates the various heavenly bodies. He thought that these facts were not discoverable by human beings. He also, in another section of the memoirs, he says Socrates' own conversation was ever of human things. And for that reason, because he felt that it was not discoverable, the intention, the meaning, the order behind the natural world, we can turn to the human things where humans, through discourses, through opinions, have tried to get together and provide a meaning, so to speak. And let's try to examine those meanings. So when we once again transpose this back to the question of how to interpret Plato's text, we need to ask, is Plato's intention somehow available to us? If divine intention is not available to us, is Plato's intention somehow available to us? Or can we only hope to uncover, and this is where we get back to the Phaedo, Socrates, his own intellectual autobiography of how he turned from the natural things to the study of the human things through discourses, rather than, let's say, another's intentions. Maybe what we have is the way these things appear to us, and as they're disclosed by means of dialogue and discourse. Now, this question of authorial intent, I've discussed this a bit here, and it's probably a fundamental question, I think. People, obviously in literary theory, and I'll talk about that, but has far-reaching implications of how we lead our lives, but it's ultimately an irresolvable question, I think. The question of authorial intent is a fundamental one. It's tied to so many aspects of the intellectual tradition. First of all, it's tied to these fundamental problems within literary theory. How do we interpret texts? So our basic inclination, I think our average every day when we're approaching something, even in an unarticulated way, our assumption is that we're going to uncover the meaning of a work, a literary work, any written text, to the extent that we understand the intention of the author. And those become equivalent. Meaning is tied to its intention. And there's definitely truth to that. And that is absolutely fundamental part of our experience of trying to encounter texts, or whether it's reading or trying to understand the spoken discourse of another. What does that person mean by that? I think is our general point of departure, to try to, we won't have approached the meaning of that discourse unless we've somehow gotten close to the intention. However, upon rational or theoretical reflection, theorists inform us that focusing on the intention is to commit the intentional fallacy. And when we talk about new criticism, I'll go into that in more detail. Or the theorists would point out that the author is dead. Remember Socrates' discussion of the dead letter of writing, that father, the author, is gone. The death of the author is the death of God, the grounding principle behind that text. All we have is this written fragment that's left. There's no guarantor behind there that can come and defend that writing and tell you what it's really about. Or we're reminded that the author, as a notion, is merely this function of discursive forces, that it's an invented concept, so to speak. This would be Foucault who articulates that most clearly. So this notion of authorial intent is important, obviously, for literary theory, but it's also fundamental, I think, to questions around philosophic methodologies, namely, very important with respect to political philosophy, but how we approach the texts of the philosophical tradition. And this is where we see distinctions between the non-historicist approach of a Leo Strauss, as I've already indicated, who would see point of departure as trying to get as close as possible to the authorial intention. Heidegger, Gadamer, whose point of departure is a hermeneutic historical approach, where that intention of the past is always only going to be, let's say, filtered through the horizon of the present. So again, my own point of departure is I think this is an irresolvable conflict, and I can see the merits of both of those positions, and I can see even a dialogue of those two positions of where we need to end up in our critical practice. So the third way of thinking about this question of authorial intent that I'll point to is in terms of how we lead our lives. if if there is, let's say, a purpose to existence, what's the meaning of life? We say, is that going to be discovered through my own unaided human reason, or do I have to defer to some sort of divine revelation of that? And so the let's say the tension within the Western tradition between reason and revelation points to, again, this question of authorial intent, to this tension that's fundamental to the Western tradition itself. So, if we're going to get as close as possible to Plato's authorial intent, maybe we can't get it exactly, but if we're trying to approximate it, if we take into account the dialogue as a form, we take into account that it's written, we take into account that it's maybe some sort of organic unity, but also supplemented by other texts. We also need to take into account, and this is getting back to the dialogue as form question, title, who are the interlocutors, what's their status, the setting, is it narrated or performed? So is there someone saying, well, this happened a while ago, then he said, she said, or is it performed, or mimetic dialogue? So other terms for that are diegetic, which is narrated, or mimetic, which is performed. Mimetic is just, we have the speech tags, Socrates, colon, and then the speech of Socrates. There it's approaching as closely as possible to an actual drama. So just as a play would just have speech tags with no narrative filter. We have to pay attention to the relationship of the speeches, the logoi, to the deeds, as well as to imagery. And this approach, again, I point to John Sallis's book on this, Being and Logos. As well, I have an introduction to Plato's Republic that tries to schematize this threefold manner of reading. And the dramatic context, so the date, what's happening in the dramatic context, and for a certain approach to trying to give the dramatic dates of all the dialogues, I'll put in the link there. I have a chart with the dramatic dialogue, the dialogues in dramatic order. Catherine Zuckert's book on Plato is very good there. So I've based that list largely on Catherine Zuckert with some revisions. For instance, for one example of a set of dialogues where it's important to know the dramatic dates, and I'll close with this, a set of dialogues, for instance, that are set during the final days of Socrates' life, so just before, during, and immediately after his trial, we see the dialogues below. So this context is crucial to understanding what's going on in these dialogues. So all of them, to some extent, are extended defenses of the Socratic way of life. That's just one of the barest means. So we have an apology for Socrates in all of these dialogues. So we have the Theaetetus on knowledge, then the Euthyphro, then the Cratylus on the correctness of names, then the sophist, then the statesman. He then goes to the trial. The apology of Socrates is his defense speech, as well as some other exchanges. He's then imprisoned. We have the dialogue on called Crito, and then final dialogue, which depicts this discussion on the soul, called the Phaedo, where we also have the depiction of Socrates' death. So that's one example of how knowing the dramatic context of the dialogue is important. So there's the drama within the dialogue itself, but also its context. And with that, I will close. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion of how to read a Platonic dialogue, and I'll see you at the next video. Thank you.